Alright, let's go. Number 10. The murdered room beneath Pueblo Bonito and the chocolate that shouldn't have been there. Chaco Canyon holds heat and light the way few places on Earth do sandstone walls that turn the afternoon sun into something almost physical. A silence broken only by wind moving across rock that hasn't visibly changed in 1,000 years. It was into this canyon in 1896 that a team from the Hyde Exploring Expedition sank a trench into Pueblo Bonito. At its peak, an interconnected complex of roughly 800 rooms, rising as high as 5 stories, the largest building anywhere in North America until the 19th century. Deep inside it, in a chamber, later cataloged simply as Room 28, they uncovered 174 whole ceramic vessels, cached together in an almost absurd concentration of intact pottery for one room. A later expedition backed by the National Geographic Society between 1920 and 1927 pulled even more from the same complex, a nearby room holding over 50,000 pieces of turquoise, 4,000 pieces of jet, and the skeletons of 14 scarlet macaws, birds that exist nowhere near this desert and had to be carried here alive across hundreds of miles from the jungles of Mexico. For decades, Room 28's vessels sat quietly in museum storage, their purpose an open question nobody yet had the tools to answer. Then, in 2009, University of New Mexico, archaeologist Patricia Crown and Hershey Company chemist W. Jeffrey Hurst ran organic residue analysis on fragments of the room's distinctive cylinder-shaped jars pulled years earlier from trash mounds south of Pueblo Bonito. What came back published that year in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences was theobromine, the unmistakable chemical fingerprint of cacao, chocolate. In the 11th century American Southwest, 1,000 miles from the nearest place a cacao tree can grow. The chemistry itself isn't in question. It's been checked, and it holds. Theobromine doesn't occur naturally anywhere near Chaco, and roughly 200 of these cylinder jars are known to exist anywhere in the archaeological record, most of them from this one room, vessels so distinctive that generations of archaeologists before Crown had puzzled over what could justify keeping so many in one place, guessing at drums with skin stretched over the openings, or hidden caches of turquoise. The chemistry finally settled that argument. In 2013, Crown reopened Room 28 itself, spending 23 days with a team of students re-excavating a chamber first dug over a century before, and confirmed what her colleagues would later lay out in the 0.4 century. 2020 monograph, The House of the Cylinder Jars. The room hadn't simply been abandoned. It had been ritually terminated by fire. But here's where established fact gives way to interpretation, and it's worth being honest about exactly where that line sits. That a fire ended Room 28 deliberately is solid archaeology. Why is not and can't be, since nobody at Chaco left behind a written word to explain it. What we do have is context across the wider canyon. Great kivas were found deliberately burned, and great house doorways deliberately sealed with masonry. Clustered around the same window of time, roughly 1,150 CE, when tree ring records show a 50-year drought settling over the San Juan Basin, and monumental construction across the entire canyon simply stops. Think about the sequence that context suggests. A society doesn't just watch its rain disappear and walk away. Before it walks away, it goes to the room holding its rarest imported luxury, a beverage carried up a supply chain 1,000 miles long, and burns that room on purpose thoroughly, the way you'd conduct a funeral, rather than flee. Fire. That is not panic. Panic doesn't stop to seal doors first. It looks instead like a decision that the room itself, like a body, had to be properly finished before its keepers could leave it behind for good. The people who once lifted those cylinder jars to their lips walked out of Chaco Canyon, and within a century, the greatest works of architecture the prehistoric Southwest would ever produce stood empty under a hard desert sky. They carried almost nothing away with them. What they left, they made certain, was already dead. Number 9. The Vanished Feast Halls of Neolithic Scotland. Picture the River Dee on a grey Aberdeenshire morning mist, sitting low over ploughed fields that look from the ground like nothing at all. From the air in the 1970s, they looked like something else entirely. A crop mark at a place called Balbridie, the ghost outline of a massive timber structure buried beneath the soil. When archaeologists excavated it, the building they uncovered looked at first glance exactly like the great feasting hall of an early medieval king, the kind of hall described in Beowulf timber and smoke and long tables. Then the radiocarbon dates came back, published by Alexandra Fairweather and Ian Ralston in the journal Antiquity in 1993, and the hall wasn't early medieval at all. It was roughly 5,000 years older. Neolithic. Balbrigdy wasn't alone. At Claish near Stirling, archaeologists Gordon Barclay, Kenneth Brophy, and Gavin McGregor excavated a near-identical structure in 2001 25 meters long, 9.5 wide Bayesian-modeled radiocarbon dates, placing its use between roughly 3,700 and 3,650 BC. A third at Warrenfield near Crays was excavated by Hillary and J.C. Murray, 3 halls, 3 counties. All among the largest roofed buildings anyone in Britain would raise, for the next 3,000 years, built from squared jointed oak at a level of carpentry. Nobody expected to find this early in the record. And every single one ends the same way, burned to the ground. These were not small undertakings. Raising a hall this size this early meant felling and shaping enormous timbers with stone tools, coordinating labor on a scale unlike anything else being built in Neolithic Scotland. Archaeologist Gordon Noble, whose 2006 book on the period carries the blunt title Neolithic Scotland, Timber, Stone, Earth, and Fire, argues that burning wasn't incidental to how these early farming communities marked their monuments. It was close to the point of them echoed in the same period, by the ritual burning of megalithic tomb structures elsewhere in Western Europe. And then after apparently short use in some cases, perhaps no more than a single generation, each community set its own hall alight. That the halls were built, used briefly, and burned is where the certainty ends and the argument begins. Here's where conventional archaeology finds itself arguing with its own evidence. One influential reading, drawing on work by archaeologist Alison Sheridan, proposes that these halls served as communal houses for the very first generations of farmers, newly arrived in Scotland from the continent, a founding population living and working together before the settlement was secure enough to split into smaller individual family households. At that point in the clinical language, archaeologists reach for the hall was decommissioned by fire. It's an elegant theory, and it's a theory. Nobody has proof of what these first Scottish farmers actually believed as they watched their own hall burn. Decommissioned is a word for a filing cabinet, not for the one roof an entire founding community once slept, ate, and buried its dead beneath. If Sheridan's reading holds, then the very first major structure Neolithic farmers raised together on this island was built from the outset with an expiration date designed to be burned the moment its purpose, holding a fledgling people together, had been fulfilled. 3 halls, 3 separate locations, 1 identical ending. That is not coincidence. In prehistory, a repeated pattern is the closest thing we get to a sentence spoken by people who left no writing behind. We don't know the names of the people who built Balbrigdy Claish or Warrenfield. We know only that they built something large enough to shelter a founding generation, and that when its work was done, they did not let it stand and rot quietly into the landscape. They chose fire. Something had to be finished deliberately before those first Scottish farmers could become anything new. Number 8. The burnt village of Tel Sabi Abyad, and the bureaucracy that only survives because it burned. Northern Syria, the Balik Valley, a low mound rising out of flat farmland, baked hard by a Mesopotamian summer. Since 1986, Leiden University archaeologist Peter Ackermans has directed excavations at Tel Sabi Abyad, a site occupied almost continuously from roughly 7,200 to 5,500 BCE. In levels dated to around 6,000 BCE, his teams uncovered a cluster of rectangular paise, walled storehouses, a settlement now known simply as the Burnt Village, because every one of those buildings had been consumed by an intensely hot fire. What that fire preserved is what makes the site extraordinary. Hundreds of small clay ceilings, each stamped with an individual seal design, alongside dozens of clay tokens used as counters. One of the earliest known systems anywhere on Earth for tracking property debts and ownership, roughly 2,000 years before writing was invented. Researchers cataloging the assemblage have described the sheer number of distinct seal designs recovered from a single occupation level as far more than anyone excavating a settlement this old had ever expected to find in one place. In one burned building alone, designated V6, excavators recovered several dozen more ceilings, alongside a crouched human burial beneath the floor, a detail that ties the fire not just to storage and administration, but to death itself. No other human remains were recovered from inside the burned buildings, which rules out the simplest reading of the wider village, a massacre that caught its victims where they stood. Here's the honest state of the evidence. That the fire happened, and happened around 6000 BCE, is settled. More than 100 radiocarbon dates from the site make this one of the best dated late Neolithic sequences in the Near East. That the fire preserved an early administrative system is settled too. The sealings and tokens are sitting in museum collections today, available for anyone to examine. What is not settled, and may never be, is who lit the match. Elsewhere at the site, Ackermans has identified circular structures with hard-fired interior plaster, consistent with a mundane, practical explanation, burning out a building's interior to fumigate it against pests before reuse. That's the boring answer, and it may well be correct for those specific structures. It does not obviously explain the burnt village itself, where an entire cluster of storerooms, packed with a young settlement's administrative memory, and at least one deliberate burial went up in flame, with no evidence of an outside attack, which has led researchers, Ackermans among them, to seriously entertain a stranger possibility that the fire was set on purpose by the very community that depended on the records it destroyed. Sit with what that would mean if it's right. A society at the very edge of inventing formal ownership tokens for grain seals for property, an entire administrative vocabulary being built for the first time in human history, chose or was forced to burn that vocabulary down. Not lose it to theft, not lose it to war. Simply end it deliberately in fire at the precise historical moment such a system was being born. Whatever debts, obligations, or claims those clay seals once represented, someone decided they needed to end in flame rather than simply end. The oldest paperwork ever recovered from the human past survives today for exactly one reason, because someone 8,000 years ago decided it had to die. Number 7. Devastin and the machine that learned to find dead houses. In 1968, American archaeologist Alan McFerrin of the University of Pittsburgh and Serbian archaeologist Dragislav Srehović began a joint excavation at Devastin in central Serbia, a project whose full findings would eventually fill a 500-page volume, Devastin and the Neolithic of Central Serbia, published in 1988. Beneath the plow soil, they uncover house floors as large as 6 meters by 18 meters, burned so thoroughly that the packed earth and straw has turned into a brick-red material, as hard and durable as pottery brittle underfoot, unmistakable even to an untrained eye. From the wreckage of a single house came more than 80 reconstructible ceramic vessels, an entire household's belongings preserved intact by the very fire that ended it. These aren't houses that caught fire. They are houses that were fired turned deliberately or not into ceramic. That October, McFerrin requests help from the Yugoslav Geomagnetic Institute, and a team arrives carrying a proton magnetometer, an instrument designed for surveying mineral deposits, dragged instead across a Neolithic field. It locates a series of disturbances beneath the soil. Every single one, when excavated, turns out to be another burned house floor. For the first time, archaeologists have a way to map an entire vanished settlement of fired ruins without digging a single test trench, because the burning had been so intense that it left a permanent scar in the magnetic signature of the Earth itself. 7,000 years later. Within a few years, the same method spreads to other viticulture sites across Serbia, and the same result keeps repeating wherever a magnetic anomaly appears. A burned floor is waiting beneath it. For decades, the default explanation for finds like this was the least dramatic one available: accidents. Lightning strikes. Cooking fires that got away from someone. That explanation is not a straw man. It was the genuine scholarly consensus for a long time, and it's a reasonable first guess. But here's where it runs into a problem it cannot get past. If accidental fire were destroying Neolithic villages at this frequency, at this many sites, generation after generation, for centuries on end, the people of the Balkan Neolithic would have to be counted among the unluckiest populations in the entire archaeological record, and what's missing from these burned layers is just as telling as what's present. No burned human remains. No weapons. None of the signature of an attack or a catastrophe, just structure after structure reduced to fired clay, with a regularity that starts to look less like misfortune and more like a schedule. What's left instead is a signature of care. Someone gathered fuel a wattle and daub house doesn't naturally contain. Someone arranged it beneath walls that otherwise resist burning at the temperatures these floors actually reached. Someone did this again and again across generations for reasons they never explained to anyone who could write it down, leaving us 7,000 years later, holding a magnetometer tracing scars in the dirt, guessing at motive from the shape of an absent. Whatever these people believed about how a house was supposed to die, they built an entire relationship with permanence around it, one in which nothing, not even the walls that sheltered a family's children, was permitted to simply decay on its own. It had to be ended formally in fire before the ground beneath it could be trusted to hold something new. We don't know if they mourned. We only know they never once let a house quietly rot. Number 6. Celovac and the experiment that ruled out an accident. In 1979, archaeologists H. Arthur Bankoff and Frederick Winter do something almost nobody else studying the Neolithic Balkans had attempted. They stop theorizing and go build one. Near Celovac in Serbia, they raise a full-scale replica of a wattle and daub house, using the same construction techniques as the culture they're studying, and set it on fire to see firsthand with their own eyes what an actual accidental house fire does to a structure like this. The result, published in the journal Archaeology, is unambiguous. An uncontrolled fire burns fast and unevenly. It leaves scattered pockets of ash and minimal fusion. The structure collapses before the clay ever reaches the temperatures needed to harden it into anything durable. That is not what excavators actually find at Celovac itself, where Ruth Tringham and Dusan Kristic's excavation, published as Celovac, a Neolithic village in Yugoslavia, in 1990 uncovered house floors, turned into dense, thoroughly vitrified masses of fired clay and storage bins, still packed with charred einkorn wheat, sealed in place by the very fire that ended the ford off and house around them. The same team with Stevanovic later refined their methods further at a related Vinca culture tell called Gomolava along the Sava River, confirming Celovac was no isolated case. Producing preservation like this requires sustained, controlled, oxygen-fed heat, someone breaking holes into walls and roofs, deliberately to let a fire breathe, and feeding it for as long as it takes to turn an entire house into something closer to a kailine-fired pot. That comparison replica against reality is where the accident explanation quietly runs out of road. Here's where it gets stranger rather than simpler. Celovac wasn't burned once. Tringham identified an entire burning horizon, spanning levels 3 and IV of the site, occupied across several centuries in the later 5th millennium BC, with individual village clusters ranging in size from as little as 3 hectares to as much as 15. And the character of the burning changes as the centuries pass. In the earliest levels, houses are rebuilt directly on the ashes of their predecessors. Same footprint, same spot. In the later levels, houses shift position entirely, spreading horizontally across the settlement, alongside a rise in personal ornamentation, storage capacity, and figurines tied to individual households. Tringham herself cataloged roughly 10 separate lines of evidence, connecting the burning horizon to this deepening social change, the visible signature of a community growing more complex, more differentiated, even as it kept right on, burning its own homes. What that changing pattern meant to the people living through it is interpretation, not measurement, but the pattern itself, the shifting and the burning together, is right there in the stratigraphy for anyone to check. Which means house burning at Celovac wasn't a single frozen custom. It evolved in step with the society practicing it, tracking every shift in how people related to their households, their belongings, and each other. Somewhere in those centuries of repeated fire is the story of a community becoming something more complicated than the generation before it, and burning down its own houses was apparently how it marked every new stage of that transformation. They rebuilt on the ashes of their own lives, over and over for a span of time longer than the entire history of the country that now houses their excavation reports. Every time before something new could rise, something old had to be reduced to fire and bone-white fired clay. We built the experiment. It proved conclusively that this could not have been an accident. It still cannot tell us why. Number 5. Opovo, and the study that finally called it what it was. In the mid-1980s, Ruth Tringham directs the Opovo archaeological project in Serbia, assembling a genuinely international team of specialists, zoo archaeologists, botanists, ceramicists, and hands the analysis of the site's burned architecture to a doctoral student named Mirjana. Stevanovich. Excavating at Opovo demanded a method that hadn't existed before. A grid of 1-meter squares laid directly over the collapsed ruin of every house so that each fragment of fallen daub could be lifted, catalogued by hand, and mapped back to the exact position on the wall or roof it had fallen from centimeter by centimeter. What Stevanovich builds from that painstaking work becomes her 1,996 doctoral dissertation at the University of California, Berkeley, and then in 1997, a 61-page paper in the Journal of Anthropological Archaeology titled The Age of Clay, The Social Dynamics of House Destruction. Stevanovich's method involved reconstructing piece by piece exactly how each house collapsed the temperature reached, whether the fire had enough oxygen to burn as completely as it did, whether extra fuel had clearly been introduced, beyond what the house naturally contained. Her conclusion stated with unusual directness for an academic paper, it was unlikely that the houses were burned as a result of a series of accidents, and they were instead, in her words, destroyed by deliberate burning, and most likely for reasons of a symbolic nature. Zoo archaeologist Nerissa Russell, working animal bone evidence into the same project, arrived at a matching conclusion from an entirely different angle. The team found it was extremely difficult to set fire to a wattle and daub house at all, without deliberately breaking holes into the walls and roof first, to let the flames breathe. Two independent lines of evidence, bone and clay, converging on the same verdict. That verdict, deliberate ignition, is about as close to settled fact as archaeology gets on a question this old. This was never a local habit confined to one village. By Stevanovich's own account, the phenomenon recurs across a region that at its broadest reconstruction spans what is today Serbia, Croatia, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine, an area larger than the whole of Great Britain, sustained across the entire Neolithic of Southeast Europe. The mystery deepens exactly where the hard science stops. Stevanovich didn't halt at proving intent. She went further, proposing a specific reason for it, tied to what she called a house's post-utilitarian visibility. The idea that a house needed to be seen to be properly finished, its ending performed publicly, in order to demonstrate the continuity of the people who had lived inside it. That part, the why, is her interpretation, offered as the most persuasive reading of the evidence, not a measurement anyone can independently verify the way you can verify a radiocarbon date. In other words, the burning itself is fact. The meaning of the burning is argument. And it's a genuinely compelling one because if she's right, this wasn't destruction in any ordinary sense. It functioned more like a monument. Consider what that implies about how these people understood a home. Not a shelter you occupy until it eventually collapses, but a structure with a defined lifespan, whose ending had to be witnessed by the community and left visible on the landscape afterward, not hidden, not left to decay invisibly, but publicly unmistakably dead, the way a grave marker announces a life that has ended rather than simply been forgotten. Every mound across the Balkans that archaeologists today casually label a tell is under this reading not merely an accumulation of rubbish and collapsed rubble. It's a stack of these formal announcements, one built directly on top of the last, each one a witnessed deliberate ending. They lived inside structures they always intended to kill, and when the day came, they did not hide the body. They made sure the entire community could watch it burn, so that everyone would understand without needing to be told in words that something had properly finally ended. Number 4. Vincha Belo Brdo, the mound that gave a mystery its name. On a river terrace above the Danube east of Belgrade sits a low hill the local villagers once simply called Belo Brdo White Hill. In 1908, a Serbian professor named Milije Vasic began digging into it. He returned across 4 separate campaigns through 1934, at one point funded by the Russian Archaeological Institute of Constantinople, slowly discovering that the hill wasn't a hill at all. It was a telemound, built entirely from the compacted remains of a single settlement, rebuilt on top of itself again and again for nearly 1,000 years, beginning around 5,700 BCE. Among the wreckage of one burned house, Vasic found a ceramic bowl with a single grain of charred wheat still resting inside. It sealed there by accident, by the same fire that ended the house around it, a small ordinary detail that survived, only because everything around it burned. By the time modern researchers finished reanalyzing the site, a Bayesian radiocarbon study led by archaeologist Nenad Tasic and colleagues published in the journal Antiquity in 2015, and drawing on 85 separate radiocarbon measurements. The tell held 9 meters of continuous cultural deposits over 10 meters of total height, and layer after layer, the same recurring signature burned house horizons, stacked one directly on top of the last, right up to the final Neolithic occupation at the very top of the mound. None of that is speculation. It's stratigraphy measured, dated, and cross-checked by an international team, a century after Vasich first put a spade into the ground. 9 meters of compacted habitation is 9 meters of a single community, choosing generation after generation across a span of time longer than the distance separating us today from the founding of ancient Rome to burn down what it had built and rebuild directly on top of the ash. This was not a community in decline. Vinci-culture is credited with some of the earliest copper metallurgy anywhere in the archaeological record, people pushing the technological frontier of their era who nonetheless kept setting their own homes alight. Later analysis of household remains from these upper layers even suggests some families were storing measurably more wheat and wild pears than others, a hint of early economic inequality creeping into a society whose defining public ritual was watching a house burn to the ground before everyone's eyes. That inequality reading is a more recent and more provisional piece of the puzzle than the burning itself, worth flagging honestly, but it's a serious one, argued from real archaeobotanical data rather than guesswork. Here's where the story stops being about one hill. Vincibello Bordeaux isn't unique. It's simply the type site the place excavated first, and most extensively, the place that gave an entire prehistoric culture its name. Once researchers knew what signature to look for, they began finding it again and again at Divaston, at Selivac, at Opovo, and at dozens upon dozens of other sites scattered across an area larger than modern Britain, in a culture that predates the pyramids of Egypt by nearly 3,000 years. This means the impulse to formally ritually burn one's own home was never a local eccentricity belonging to one village on the Danube. It was one of the most widespread, most consistently repeated behavioral patterns of an entire prehistoric world, sustained across dozens of generations for roughly 1,000 years, spanning territory divided today among 7 separate countries. And it left almost no direct explanation of why, because the only voice these people left behind is the shape of the fires they set. Vasich spent 26 years digging into a hill that turned out to be 9 meters of ash floor repeating, and by the time he finished, his own name was permanently attached to a culture whose defining, distinguishing act was bash, fire. Every layer he uncovered was another generation, choosing the identical ending. An entire people is remembered today by the thing they did over and over to make room for the next version of themselves. Number 3. Nebelivka and the city mapped without a single shovel. Picture wheat fields in Kirovohrad Oblast, central Ukraine, flat to the horizon, giving away nothing to the naked eye. Beneath them, a joint British-Ukrainian team archaeologists, John Chapman and Basurka Gaidarska of Durham University, working with Ukrainian colleagues as part of the AHRC-funded Trypillia Megasites project, conducted a geomagnetic survey across 238 hectares near the modern village of Nebelivka. No large-scale digging, just instruments dragged across the soil in slow, careful transects, reading disturbances buried meters below. The resulting plan, the only complete map of one of these Trypillia megasites ever produced, reveals 1,445 individual houses laid out in a deliberate concentric ring around open public space, encircling a megastructure large enough that when Chapman, Gaidarska, and colleagues excavated it, they published their findings under a title referencing Roland Fletcher's conundrum, the long-standing puzzle, raised by the Australian archaeologist of that name, of how any settlement this sprawling, at this low, a housing density could function at all without collapsing under its own social weight. Of Nebelivka's 1,445 houses, 1,077 show burning intense enough to leave behind a compact mass of fired clay debris, what Ukrainian archaeologists call a ploshchadka. Those numbers are survey data, not estimation, a hard count against a hard map. That is not a settlement that suffered a single tragedy. That is close to 3 out of every 4 houses in an entire planned city individually and deliberately reduced to fire, in a pattern too widespread and too internally consistent to be anything but standard expected practice. Here's where the researchers did something almost nobody else in this field has attempted. Unsatisfied with theory alone, the Neolithic team, working with residents of the modern village, built an actual two-story reconstruction of a Trypillia house using period-accurate materials, then burned it, documenting every stage, on camera, to understand exactly how long the process took, how much fuel it consumed, and what remained once the fire went out. Even with a modern crew fully in control of the burn, the walls collapsed unevenly section by section as the fuel supply ran short in places, a small, humbling reminder of just how much sustained effort the original 6,000-year-old version of this act must have demanded from an entire household working together. Their published account of the experiment carries a title borrowed directly from how the modern villagers themselves described watching it happen. They called their paper a good death, and it's worth being clear that this is the excavator's own chosen framing for an emotional impression, not a claim they're making about what Neolithic people actually believed 6,000 years earlier. The map is fact. The feeling behind the fire is something we can only reach for carefully in language borrowed from our own world. Sit with that phrase for a moment anyway. Not a disaster, not a loss. A good death language a community today reached for, instinctively watching a fire they had set with their own hands. If a modern Ukrainian village standing at the edge of a fire they chose to light reaches for the vocabulary of a peaceful, well-managed ending, what does it suggest about what the original builders might have believed they were doing 6,000 years earlier, when they set their own homes alight, deliberately generation after generation, beneath a wheat field without turning over a single spade of soil? Researchers found the ghost outline of nearly 1,500 homes, 3 out of every 4 of them ended on purpose in fire, by people whose only surviving vocabulary for soul. What they built is the shape it still leaves in the magnetic field of the earth itself. Number 2, Talyanki and Maidanetsky, the biggest cities on earth that almost nobody has heard of. In the 1960s, a Soviet military topographer named Konstantin Shishkin is bent over aerial reconnaissance photographs of the Ukrainian forest steppe when he notices a shadow across a wheat field, a faint discoloration where crops grow differently over ground disturbed thousands of years earlier. The same shadow is still faintly visible in satellite imagery today if you know exactly where to look. What it outlines decades of subsequent excavation would reveal is one of the largest prehistoric settlements ever documented anywhere on the planet. Talyanki in central Ukraine spans somewhere between roughly 320 and 450 hectares, depending on the survey method used, and is currently estimated to have housed as many as 14 to 15,000 people at its peak, around 3,700 to 3,500 BCE. 10 kilometers away sits Maidanetsky, nearly 200 hectares, roughly 12,000 inhabitants, excavated since 2011 by Johannes Müller of the University of Kiel and an international team using systematic geomagnetic mapping. 30 kilometers further south is Neolithic, and beyond it, sites like Dobrovity round out a cluster of these settlements, some only tens of kilometers apart, almost certainly standing at least partially contemporaneous with one another. Together, these Trypillia megasites are, by footprint and estimated population, credible contenders for the largest planned human settlements anywhere on Earth during the entire 4th millennium BCE. The hectare counts and population estimates come from repeated, independently verified surveys. That part is measurement, not marketing. For over a century, history books credited Uruk in southern Mesopotamia as the first true city ever built by human beings, a settlement with monumental temple complexes, an emerging class of priests and administrators, and eventually the world's first writing system. By some measurements, Talyanki was larger, and it existed centuries before Uruk's urban development had properly begun. For most of the 20th century, this simply wasn't part of the story anyone told about the origins of cities. The megasites of the Ukrainian forest steppe were treated as a regional curiosity at best, by scholars trained to look for the trappings of civilization, palaces, temples, kings in the deserts of the Near East, not the black soil of Eastern Europe. It has taken 20 years of patient, largely unglamorous geomagnetic survey work to force a correction to that assumption. Whether these settlements deserve to be called cities at all is a genuine live argument inside the field, not a settled consensus, and it's worth saying so plainly. For decades, city meant writing a ruling elite monumental temples, a class of specialists who never touched a plow. The Trypillia megasites have almost none of that. No palaces, no temples, no obvious ruling class visible anywhere in the archaeological record, and no writing at all. Mueller argues these settlements were functionally cities, regardless not because of their size, but because their layout was planned as a complete deliberate design, from the very first house built by and for people who could live a kilometer from a neighbor they would never personally meet. Other archaeologists, working the same data, reached different conclusions about what to call them. What nobody disputes is the size, the planning, and what happened to them. Every one of these cities, the largest planned human settlements their entire era on the planet had produced, met precisely the same end as the single-room houses of Devastan, Selavac, and Opovo fire, house by house, again and again, across each megasite's roughly 150-year lifespan before being abandoned outright and never rebuilt on the same ground. A civilization capable of designing and populating the largest cities its world had ever seen, never once attempted to make one of them permanent. Every single one, without exception, was allowed or made to burn. 14,000 people once lived inside a ring of houses beneath what is now a Ukrainian wheat field, a settlement larger than the one historians spent a century calling the first city humanity ever built, and its people let it burn. Anyway, and moved on, and built another one just as large, and let that one burn too. They had by any reasonable measure the ability to make something permanent. Generation after generation, they chose not to. Number 1. The disappearance of Cucuteni Trypillia, and what it means to build the biggest thing you will ever burn. On a hillside above the Dnieper River, near Kyiv, in 1893, a Czech-born archaeologist named Vikenty Kvojka begins excavating a site called Trypillia. What he pulls from the ground is painted pottery, and the remains of burned dwellings unlike anything catalogued in the region before. He proposes controversially for his time that when a member of this culture died, their entire house was burned to the ground with them, a home for the living transformed into what he called a house of the dead. That interpretation of Kvojka's is itself a hypothesis more than a century old and still argued over. 9 years earlier in Romania, a separate settlement named Cucuteni had already revealed the same distinctive painted pottery tradition. Together, the two names would come to define a single vanished civilization. What Kvojka could not yet know was the true scale of what he had found. A farming culture that endured in some form for nearly 2,750 years longer than the span separating us today from the founding of ancient Rome, across an area exceeding 250,000 square kilometers of what is now Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania. At its height, roughly between 4,100 and 3,400 BCE, it built the megasites, Talianki, Maidanetsky, Nebelivka, and dozens more, the largest concentrations of human beings living in one place found anywhere on the planet at that time. Every single one of them burned repeatedly ritually by design. That much, the scale, the dating, the burning, is established archaeology cross-checked by multiple independent teams over several decades. This is a civilization that built, then deliberately destroyed, then rebuilt, then destroyed. Again, the largest human settlements on Earth, on a cycle of roughly 60 to 80 years for the better part of a millennium. And then within a few centuries, after roughly 3,300 BCE, all of it simply stopped. This is where the story turns from evidence to genuine unresolved argument, and it's worth naming that shift clearly, rather than pretending science has closed the case. Pollen and climate records show the regional environment turning sharply colder and drier after about 3,200 BCE. Arguably the worst drought Europe had experienced since the beginning of farming, severe enough to break an agricultural society built on grain surplus. That's one hypothesis, and it has real data behind it. Soil scientists offer a second millennia of continuous cultivation across the same lowest plains, exhausting nutrients. A purely agrarian society had no means to restore. Social archaeologists propose a third, more human explanation still, that a settlement of 14,000 people governed without kings, without soldiers, without any visible ruling elite, may simply have become too large to hold together. Once disputes could no longer be resolved at the scale of a village. And to the east, a different culture entirely. The Yamnaya, mobile pastoralists from the Pontic steppe, whose descendants would help carry Indo-European languages across 2 continents, had begun pressing westward from around 3,500 BCE, onward arriving in growing numbers just as the megasites emptied for the final time. 4 serious hypotheses. 4 different teams of specialists, each with real evidence behind their preferred answer. None of them fully agreed upon. None of these explanations taken alone is considered sufficient by the researchers who study them. And that's not a failure of the science. It's an honest description of where the evidence currently runs out. There are no mass graves. No burned battlefield layer to point toward a war. No single collapse horizon marking one catastrophic year. Only an ending that unfolds gradually site by site across roughly 3 centuries until tens of thousands of people who had spent 1,000 years building and ritually destroying the largest cities their world had ever produced simply stop appearing as that culture in the archaeological record. Some of their descendants likely survived, absorbed into the smaller, more dispersed cultures that followed the thread just isn't visible anymore in the material they left behind. Their own name for themselves is unknown. Their reason for burning their own greatest achievements again and again for 1,000 years survives only in the ash and in the honest, still competing guesses of people 6,000 years later, standing in wheat fields with magnetometers, trying to read a language made entirely out of fire. Every 100 years or so, they built the biggest thing they were capable of building, bigger at that moment than anything else on the planet, and then deliberately, they burned it to the ground and started again. They did not stop choosing that generation after generation for 1,000 years until the day they stopped entirely, and we still do not fully understand either decision. Nobody does. Not yet. You exist right now, at the far end of 10,000 years of human beings, choosing over and over to build things they believed would last. Buried under a Ukrainian wheat field is proof that one civilization capable of raising the largest cities anywhere on Earth never once believed that of its own. What it left behind is the only question that actually matters, handed forward across 6,000 years to whoever eventually found the ash, when the thing you have built has served its purpose. Do you let it stand and quietly rot at its own pace, or do you find the nerve to burn it yourself on your own terms and start again, believing every single time that this next one will be the one that finally lasts? If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.